All right, we're going to get started. Hello, everybody. Glad you could join. This is our second webinar in the series with the Rewilding Institute, and we're super excited to be doing this with them. And before we launch in, I want to introduce my co-host, John Davis with the Rewilding Institute. John, I don't know if you are unmuted here, but do you want to say a few words about the Rewilding Institute? Well, Jack, do you want to dive in and say a few things about?
Sure. Well, so this is a series that, as Camilla mentioned, Rewilding Institute and Project Coyote are doing together. We just had one not too long ago that was a great success. It seemed like you guys really liked it, and it looks like there's a lot more of you guys this time than there was that time. So there's growing interest in this. And so far, it's been around carnivore conservation, and we're just really happy to take part in this and facilitate in any way that we can. And we're really excited that you guys are all very excited about doing this and showing up for this. So one of the questions that happened just now was whether this was going to be available later, and Project Coyote is going to have a page once we get the extra stuff trimmed off of the video that will be emailed to everyone, so you guys will get the replay link to watch it again and again and again.
And just on that note too, we recorded the last one. So if you missed the fabulous webinar with Dave Parsons and Kim Cumbo, we did record that. It's available both on Project Coyote's site and on Rewilding's. And as Jack mentioned, we will have this available. And yeah, so let me just mention as well, I also want to thank Jack and Kaylee for handling the back end of this. I know it's not easy, and Kaylee is just getting her first Zoom experience, so we will keep improving along the way. And if you have questions along the way, you can enter them into the chat box. We will take a little bit of break. I think Adrian's going to do this in 2 segments, and we'll take a few questions, a couple of questions in between. And then at the end, hopefully John and I will be able to toggle if we're able to unmute him. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Adrian Treves. Dr. Adrian Treves is a his research focuses on ecology, scientific integrity, public trust law, and agroecosystems where crop and livestock production overlap carnivore habitat. He earned his PhD at Harvard University in 1997, and is now a professor of environmental studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He and his students work to understand and manage the balance between human needs and carnivore conservation. He has authored more than 134 scientific papers on predator-prey ecology and conservation. Most recently, Dr. Treves has been working on gold standard experiments for non-lethal methods of predator control. And I will mention that Adrian served on my graduate school committee many years ago and was one of my founding science advisory board members with Project Coyote, along with Dave Parsons. So long history together. Adrian, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Camilla. Thanks for that very generous introduction. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Great, and thanks to Callie and the Project Coyote team, and Jack and the Rewilding Institute team. And it's a privilege to be talking to you today. Thank you all for making time to listen. I'm going to describe over 20 years of research that we've been conducting. It started mainly as human-carnivore conflict and coexistence studies, and over time has morphed in ways you'll see today to look at human dimensions, attitudes, but also the biology of carnivores and the effectiveness of lethal and non-lethal methods for predator control. So I'm going to try the technology, and bear with me while I work on this. With any luck, it'll actually work. And here we go. So we thought indiscriminate killing of native predators was in the past. And we see that really isn't. There are still predator killing contests in a number of states around the country. and a lot of methods for killing native predators that are indiscriminate. We thought it was in the past, partly because of the advance of science. If you went back in history and looked at the justifications and the kind of things people were saying about predators, you would hear statements like, the only good wolf is a dead wolf, for instance. That kind of a saying would justify indiscriminate, excessive killing. And you might hear things like, once they get a taste for meat, and that would justify killing scavengers or preemptive killing of native predators, killing entire packs or even litters of pups or cubs, or statements that are sort of anecdotal or mythical, like those I just mentioned, or more recently, statements like, well, as long as it's sustainable, we can kill native predators. Those sorts of sayings might justify inhumane methods or disproportionate responses. Those kinds of sayings favor lethal over non-lethal methods of predator control. And they favor anecdote over evidence generally. Like I said, most of this is in the past in campaigns of eradication of native predators, but not entirely in the past. They're still going on. Largely, campaigns of eradication, indiscriminate, preemptive, and disproportionate killing of native predators aren't being practiced. And instead, we see a more selective pattern of predator killing. However, that also tends to rely on weak evidence and untested assumptions. My research has shown it often hinges, this sort of a program, selective predator killing, often hinges on self-proclaimed experts claiming that they kill only problem animals. So a few errors won't hurt, perhaps. And that approach to killing predators is often used to justify a lack of verification. Were they really the problem predators? Were really only a few killed? Also justifies a lack of scientific tests because the self-proclaimed experts have declared themselves experts. So we still have a ways to go, both in understanding and in managing wisely in situations where humans have problems coexisting with our native predators. And the most common justification for killing native predators is to protect human interests, right? That's almost in and of itself a value judgment, because the life of the predator is valued lower than the human interest in question. So most justifications for killing native predators are a mix of value judgments and fact claims, right? A fact claim is an assertion about reality or the state of the world or a prediction about the future. So justifications that mix those fact claims with value judgments may be hard to disentangle or contest. They may be hard to disprove, because a value judgment is a statement about what one person prefers, what they value, and the judgments they make about that. So it can be difficult to contest a justification about killing native predators that's a mix of value judgments held perhaps by a few people and fact claims that are supposed to be general, true in many, many circumstances. And yet, here I'm going to prove that all killing of native predators contains both value judgments, or contains at least value judgments, starting with we should or we should not act. That in itself is a value judgment. So all killing enfolds a value judgment, to kill or not to kill. And here's a fact claim, and I'm going to signpost how I'm making obvious to you when I make fact claims. I put a little superscript in here. I'm citing an article we did in 2009. The fact claim I'm making here is we always have more than one option when confronting a conflict with native predators, or any wildlife for that matter. We always have more than one option, to kill or not. And often we have many more than one option, right? This is a fact claim. We've proven it in the article cited at the bottom. And throughout this presentation, I'm going to use these little superscripts, sometimes referencing the source of my evidence for the fact claim at the bottom of the slide, but also saving a lot of the footnotes for the end so as not to bore you to death. And this is still good evidence for this fact claim. It has not been disputed by anyone to date. The reason I'm harping on value judgments is they're very important to change in the real world, right? Politics are based in value judgments about what policy platforms one likes. You can think even of other branches of government like the Supreme Court and moving down these images that use a mix of evidence and value judgments. And then we get demonstrations in the street, other forms of political engagement, which are often based purely on value judgments. But then in the bottom right, I have a little joke inserted there about fact claims. And if you have trouble reading this, the sign basically says, what do we want? We want evidence for change. When do we want it? After peer review. It's a little joke about how slow the scientific process is to generate evidence to test fact claims. So the other forms of political change that are on this slide often act more quickly and often don't wait for fact claims. There's an interaction between value judgments and fact claims that are super important for those of us interested in issues around native predators. We have to be able to disentangle value judgments from fact claims whenever possible. And that job is actually made quite hard because they interact with each other, even though they're apples and oranges. So the apples and oranges metaphor here is important because value judgments are changed through persuasion or perhaps the defeat of opposing values. Now, fact claims can inform value judgments, but they don't invalidate value judgments. That's the apples. On the flip side, the oranges are that value judgments inform what facts we attend to, but they don't invalidate fact claims. And fact claims can only really be challenged scientifically, not by other value judgments. So if you see what I'm getting at here, apples and oranges are both fruits, different kinds of fruits. They can interact, so you can mix them to make, a fruit juice made of apples and oranges. They can be mixed and they can interact, but they can also be separate. And that process of separating them and the process of those interactions can complicate the public policy debate about many, many features of the environment or other aspects of public policy. But it's particularly important, and I would say vexing, in predator management, and particularly in killing native predators, as I'm going to show next. So what happens often in debates over predators, especially killing predators, is that there's an entanglement of the value judgments from the fact claims. So some common value judgments made about killing predators. We cannot afford alternatives. That's pure and simple a value judgment about what somebody is willing to pay for, or some government is willing to pay for, right? We cannot afford. Some predators cannot coexist near people. That's a value judgment, although it's masquerading as a fact claim. We have to be fair to people. Again, a value judgment about who gets fairness and who doesn't. An individual animal pays the price to save the population. Again, a value judgment about the worth of individual animals. As long as we use humane methods, it is ethical. That's a value judgment about the minimum necessary conditions for killing. And finally, if sustainable and profitable, we should do it. As you can tell from many of these statements, there's a should or an ought connotation or an implicit ranking of what's important in life. Common fact claims about killing native predators are rather different. For instance, lethal management raises human tolerance. That's a fact claim. It reduces poaching. That's, again, a claim about what the world is like, that there's going to be less poaching if we do lethal management. That's a common one. Another common fact claim is that lethal management prevents losses of property. I'm going to address all of these fact claims today. In fact, I'm about to leave behind value judgments. My effort here is to signpost when people are making value judgments about native predators, about killing them or not killing them, versus when they make fact claims, separate those out. And as a scientist, I'm going to address fact claims because I've spent most of my career trying to understand if those fact claims are accurate or valid or reliable, okay? So the question marks at the bottom, those 5 question marks and fact claims are going to be the axis of this talk, the thing I hang my hat on and address in the greatest detail. But just a couple of last slides about value judgments to show here is how you might choose to analyze a set of value judgments. Claims made about what should happen in the world or what ought to be our response to coexisting with native predators. And what I've done in the columns is array a series of different criteria that are about value judgments, such as who pays, and is the method selective for a specific problem. And then what I've done in the rows is array different historical different methods for killing native predators. And then here I've made an effort, it's just my effort, and it's selected examples to differentiate the different methods by these different value judgments. What I'm trying to do here is leave my audience with kind of a roadmap of how to analyze and dissect public policy documents like government reports, whether it's from the Fish and Wildlife Service or a state and tribal agency or from a scientist, when they are using value judgments and when they're using fact claims. So this is just a roadmap. Now let's take a look at the fact claims, which is really the bulk of my presentation today. So does scientific evidence support the 5 fact claims that I've indicated are the most common justifications for killing native predators? Well, I'm going to look at the first 2 together as a bundle, and they are that lethal management raises human tolerance. And what's meant by this common claim is that human tolerance for the surviving native predators. So if you kill 1 or 2 or a few of them, or maybe many of them, the surviving ones will be tolerated more by the people who are coexisting with them. The second idea is that lethal management reduces poaching so illegal killing of the native predators. I'm going to address those 2 together, and I've spent about 15 years studying this issue. And it takes me into a realm where legal and illegal killing have to be understood because they're not independent of each other. Here I'm footnoting that I've made publicly available recent public comments from June of 2020 on a Fish and Wildlife Service proposal relating to the 10J rule for legally killing Mexican wolves down in Arizona and New Mexico. So I provide the link here. If this is, it's hyperlinked in my presentation. If that's not available to you after the fact on our platform, then please just reach out to me and I'll send you a copy of that public comment. Because I focused on the relationship between legal and illegal killing, and in particular, the attitudes and tolerance of people, which might give us hints as to whether they're going to poach Mexican wolves in this case, but it's broader than that, and the actual incidence of poaching that's observed out in the wild. Okay, so poaching is the leading cause of death in all the US wolf populations that have been studied. That's Northern Rocky Mountains, the Western Great Lakes, including red wolves in North Carolina, Mexican wolves in the southwest of the US, and in a study by Adams et al. In Alaska. Unregulated killing was the leading cause of death there. So that's one of my first conclusions, that as poaching is the leading cause of death in many US wolf populations, we really better understand all causes of death and if they affect poaching. Because if, say, legal killing were to affect poaching, could be very serious for a wolf population. And secondly, there's two kinds of poaching. There's the reported and observed poaching, and there's what's called cryptic poaching or unreported poaching that isn't detected. It's usually detected indirectly by the disappearance of collared animals, especially collared wolves in the studies we've done. Another problem with poaching is that the methods for estimating and measuring it historically have been inaccurate and systematically biased towards underestimating it. That's scientific terminology for meaning a systematic underestimate. I'm not using bias in its common English form, which suggests that somebody has a particular prejudice, judgment, or negative judgment of something. In scientific terms, a systematic bias leads to under or overestimates or inaccuracy in scientific measurement. And so what we have proven for all 4 of the wolf populations we studied in the contiguous lower 48 is that poaching has been systematically underestimated by US agencies because of an error made in assumptions about legal killing. Let me repeat that. US agencies made an error in assuming something about legal killing, and that led to an underestimate of poaching. And the error that US agencies have made in their assumptions about legal killing was that the wolves that disappeared died of the same causes as wolves they found dead. And we know for a fact that that's an inaccurate assumption. And in many cases, it's grossly inaccurate because a wolf that disappears was not killed legally by definition. It died of some other cause than legal killing. Okay, in a nutshell. And the citations to that are presented in those superscripted little numbers. You'll see a slide near the end of the first half of my presentation, which gives you the full citations for those who, like me, who are nerdy like me and like to read the actual details of methods and results. All right, so let's look at human attitudes for that first fact claim that lethal management improves human tolerance. First, intolerance for wolves is believed to cause inclinations to poach. And policies that made it easier to kill wolves in Wisconsin were followed repeatedly by declines in tolerance for wolves and increases in the inclinations to poach wolves. I'm principally citing research here by Jamie Hogberg, who did her master's in my lab and worked for a while for the Society for Conservation Biology. Actually, I believe she's still working for them or just recently left. And Christy Brown Nunez, who did a postdoc in my lab, and last contact I had with her was working for Fish and Wildlife Services international programs. And these two fantastic researchers and others in my lab have done a series of studies, and I don't expect you to read all this. I'm going to talk you through, I'm going to summarize these studies that show over time, by remeasuring the same individuals, the same individual humans, over time, that attitudes to wolves became more negative and inclinations to poach wolves increased over time as policies were relaxed on the protections for wolves and more permissions were given to kill wolves legally. Permissions such as permits to landowners, contracts to USDA Wildlife Services to kill a number of wolves suspected of attacking domestic animals or suspected of posing a threat to people. As all of these permits were issued and more legalization and liberalization of wolf killing was seen, people's attitudes and tolerance for wolves declined and their inclinations to poach increased. We showed this in mail-back surveys to thousands of Wisconsin residents. We showed it in focus groups before and after a change in the policy allowing lethal control of wolves. And this research was done with other colleagues, including Lisa Naughton and Victoria Shelley, working in my lab. Now, let's look at the actual poaching, because so far we've just been talking about human attitudes and tolerance and inclinations to poach. Well, 2 studies suggest legalizing wolf killing did not reduce poaching. First, individual wolf survival rates decreased during periods with liberalized wolf killing, independent of lethal management. That means independent of the number of wolves killed legally. The number that disappeared were lost, even though they had radio collars, soared during the periods of liberalized killing. And that comes from research by Francisco Santiago Avila out of my lab, a postdoc now. Here he's shown with his 2 dogs. Secondly, at the population level, right, Francisco's work was at the individual level. Radio-collared wolves suffered a higher hazard of disappearing and suffered a much higher incidence of disappearance during those periods of liberalized killing. Contrary to some suggestions that poaching decreased, it was dwarfed by the number of disappearances of these radio-collared wolves. So when we look at the population level, Francisco's findings on the incidence of disappearance are matched by a population model built by Guillaume Chapron here for Wisconsin and Michigan that showed repeated slowdowns in the growth of these 2 wolf populations when wolf killing was liberalized. Contrary to many misconceptions out there, these findings have not been adequately challenged. There's been a back and forth and some debate, some letters, with some flaws in them were published that criticized our findings here, but these remain strong science that have not been fundamentally challenged. And the data, especially coming from Francisco Santiago Avila, is really new as of 2019, and it's the strongest evidence thus far that legalizing wolf killing led to more disappearances of wolves and overwhelmed any slight, insignificant decrease in reported poaching. Okay, very quickly, I'm not going to go through all of this slide, but for those of you who follow Scandinavian wolf science, there's a misconception out there that Scandinavia's evidence is suggesting the opposite, that legalizing killing of Scandinavian wolves reduced poaching. We suggest the opposite, and this graph seems to support our contention. Anyway, not many of you probably follow Scandinavian science. So I would knock out these 2 fact claims. In my opinion, the evidence does not support that legal killing of wolves improves human tolerance for wolves or decreases the inclination to poach. And in fact, it seems to increase poaching as measured by disappearance of radio-collared wolves. Well, what about preventing the loss of property? So I'm going to pause here so that we can take any questions there might be. And as I promised, here are all the citations you can look at your leisure if you're interested in that kind of thing. So let's see. Camilla and John, do I need to stop sharing my screen, or can I just take questions this way?
You can just take questions that way. All right,
Sure.
I'm going to start here. Okay, so we have Susan asks, she lives in Ashland, Wisconsin for 25 years and has read most of your research. Her question is, how can we get more educational institutions that train future wildlife professions to be on the same page? For example, Sigurd Olsen Institute at Northland College, etc.
Okay, thanks for that question, Susan, and hope you're doing well. I have the same, long-term career goal to both, increase the curriculum that addresses ethics, so wildlife managers know when they're making value judgments versus when they're making fact claims and know how to evaluate those fact claims. I have the exact same long-term career goal. Sometimes it requires a generational change. If you think about it, The entire field of wildlife management began as game management by Aldo Leopold and folks like Sigurd Olsen, although Sigurd Olsen had a less utilitarian view of wildlife, I believe. So these things take culture change, and there's interesting research from the psychological fields these days on cognitive dissonance, suggesting that people who don't want to believe evidence have multiple multiple psychological ways of ignoring that evidence or disparaging the source of the evidence. So I think what we need is a combination of changing administrations in our agencies and in our governments, and changing public opinion by the steady drumbeat of clear evidence, challenging facts on the evidence, and flagging it, calling it out when people are making value judgments and pretending it's evidence. Thank you so much, Susan, for that question. Super important.
Okay, another one from Adina Boxer Capitano. She asked, can we extrapolate these findings with wolves to other predators like coyotes?
Okay, thank you, Adina. Great question. And, you know, strictly scientifically speaking, not really. More research has to be done, and we have to go beyond gray wolves. We're doing it now for Mexican wolves, the same research, and we're about to do it for red wolves. But you're right, the same question should be asked for coyotes. And in fact, if you're tuning in from Europe, probably the same question should be asked for the golden jackal. That's showing an ecological niche like coyotes, where the ability of coyotes to coexist with people and to bounce back from being killed by people has led to policies of extreme, disproportionate responses, as if there's no end in sight, as if one can kill as many as one wishes without ever examining the ethical basis for that question. So my hunch is we're going to find similar results for other predators, but at the moment we don't know. Thank you so much. Camilla, I think I should probably move on so I don't run over.
Sure. Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, so my lab has been looking for a long time at the effectiveness of non-lethal methods to protect domestic animals, principally livestock, from large predators. And I have to pivot here to explain the big picture here. We're asking often about using domestic animals like livestock guarding dogs or horses, and using ourselves to protect domestic animals from wild animals so we can eat or use the domestic animals. Does all of this make sense? I'm not going to examine that question of ethics. There's a set of value judgments buried here about whether we should be encouraging livestock in the many places that they're raised now. I don't have time for all of those, but I do encourage thought and public policy debate about these questions. So I'm going to address whether lethal and non-lethal methods work to protect livestock from predators, but I am not endorsing any of those practices with domestic animals with this talk. So first, what standard should we use for evaluating if a particular predator control method is effective in protecting livestock? Well, here I'm borrowing from the biomedical field and from psychology, where the gold standard is the randomized controlled experiment, right? This is familiar to most of you probably. The randomized controlled experiment means that subjects receiving some possible biomedical therapy are unaware whether they're getting the treatment or they're getting the placebo, and they're randomly assigned to one of those two conditions. The reason this is the gold standard, and the reason I think it should be applied to predator control also, is that it reduces bias by the researcher. It reduces unintentional and intentional bias that can distort results to the point where they are meaningless or misleading. So selection bias is principally removed by randomization. And selection bias and researcher bias are the most prevalent and pernicious biases in science. Those are the biases that lead to some therapy that actually does no good being approved by in the US by the FDA so it can go to market, and it's being prescribed by doctors even though it's not effective. Selection bias and researcher bias can lead to those terrible outcomes when researchers want something to be true, even with the best of intentions, they want something to be true that isn't. By randomizing and using a control, a placebo, we can hopefully avoid that kind of bias and spread misleading results. So this obviously applies to predator control when the government is funding and promoting and disseminating methods for predator control, including lethal methods. So let's look at how the standards of evidence have been applied in predator control. Well, unfortunately, we have not found a reliable and unbiased, what we're calling gold standard, that randomized controlled experiment. We've never found a reliable and unbiased gold standard experiment on lethal control. The only reliable ones we found for Europe and North America were this silver standard. It's a lesser standard of evidence because another variable appears. So in my little cartoon here, the two piglets are both getting the medical treatment. Some time passes, and then the researchers look, is the piglet feeling better or is the piglet still sick? And the problem with this silver standard, although, okay, let me just say that this is often the only thing possible in experimental settings. And it's very difficult to do gold standard experiments. It's possible, and we will show many examples of it, but it's difficult. And so the silver standard has often been used because of the limitations of time and money and resources. But the problem with the silver standard is that time passes and a lot of things get better over time. You know, imagine the common cold. We all get over it. So testing, evaluating a treatment for the common cold has to contend with the fact that over time, most healthy people get over the common cold anyway. Okay, so that before and after comparison of the silver standard is half as strong evidence as the gold standard. It's half as strong because in addition to the medicine, there's a second variable, that time has passed. And this applies very clearly to predator control. Whereas early as 1983, a researcher in Canada called Tampa pointed out that many instances of wolf predation on livestock were one-off occasions that were never repeated, as if perhaps the wolves moved on or something else interfered. So when time passes, sometimes problems resolve on their own without intervention. Okay, so that's an example of where we're not quite sure what might have happened, and the influence of time passing confounds the analysis. The gold standard of experiments does not have that confounding effect of time because both the treatment and the placebo undergo the change in time, and there's the randomization I referred to earlier. Okay, there's an even better standard than the gold standard. We're calling it platinum, and I have published on this several times now. That involves crossover design and some blinding of the research teams and their subjects. First, crossover design refers to where the subject starts as treatment or starts as placebo, and then midway through the experiment, they both change to the opposite condition. And blinding refers to where the researchers, some of them, are not aware of which subjects receive placebo and which receive treatment. And if possible, the subjects themselves are not aware too. Blinding is sort of it's a continuum of steps one takes to reduce bias. And these two steps, crossover design and blinding, can reduce a whole other set of biases to make our science stronger. They reduce the variability between, the effect of the variability between different subjects. Imagine it was livestock herds. Differences between livestock herds can confuse and confound regular experiments But if we do crossover design, the one herd is compared to itself in different conditions. And likewise, the blinding increases the strength of our inference, the confidence about our results, by further reducing the possibility of researcher bias or subject bias. You know, subjects often want the treatment to work, and that can strongly bias the results. So let's take a look at some gold standard experiments that have been conducted on non-lethal methods to protect livestock. I'm only showing you non-lethal methods because I have never found a reliable, unbiased gold standard experiment on lethal methods in the scientific literature. In fact, we've only found 4 different methods tested with the gold standard, and they're all non-lethal. So starting with livestock guarding dogs, in experiments all the way back to 2010 in Michigan, livestock guarding dogs were found to be effective in protecting pastured sheep against bears and wolves in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Similar experiments on fladry, shown in the middle, this Polish device originally used by hunters but now deployed for the protection of livestock, has been shown to be effective in working livestock operations in the field against wolves, not so much against coyotes and bears, although there's promising results about narrowing the distance between the flagging so that fladry can be rendered effective against coyotes. Moving clockwise, fox lights have been shown to be effective in deterring pumas from attacking alpacas and llamas in the high Andean plateau of Chile by Dr. Omar Orens, who completed his PhD in my lab. And most recently, bottom right, and yes, you're looking at a cow's rear end there. Gold standard experiment was done with eye spots painted on the rear end in order to deter leopards and lions from attacking cattle in southern Africa. So we have examples from non-lethal methods proven effective. These 4 are all proven effective in those particular settings against particular predators to protect particular livestock. We have gold standard evidence for the effectiveness of non-lethal methods. Well, what about all the other research done around the world? First, I'm going to start with some of the more hopeful lights coming out of my lab. Gold standard or better, maybe platinum standard, we're hoping. Experiments underway to protect livestock. Alexandra Pineda Guerrero is testing mobile fox lights in Colombia against jaguars and pumas. Abigail Fergus is testing fox lights and fladry in Wisconsin against wolves, black bears, coyotes. And Naomi Lacharn, sorry I cut off her first name there, and Joe Engelhart are testing range riders in Alberta against grizzlies and wolves primarily. So stay posted, please. Hopefully we'll have some more non-lethal methods to add to our list, and even stronger evidence than gold standard, I hope. We did a review of other research done by other folks for the last 40, 45 years in North America and Europe, and we used these standards, the gold standard and the silver standard, and did a close reading of methods and results, looking for biases that would have made these studies unreliable despite using gold or silver standard. We were actually left with only 11 studies in the end. So of a starting group of 26 that were silver or gold standard, we had to discard 15 of them as scientifically biased by one or more reasons. We were left with 11 studies that met the criteria. 3 were gold standard and 8 were silver standard. Since then, like in the previous slide, a couple more gold standard non-lethal methods have cropped up. Only a single study of lethal control now remains reliable, and it was silver standard. It addressed European or Eurasian lynx in Scandinavia, and that study didn't, and it was a lethal method, but it did not distinguish legal control by government agents from hunting or from trapping or poaching. and therefore we're left with some question marks about the effectiveness of lethal control for protecting sheep from lynx in Scandinavia, even with that one study. But all in all, this is not much evidence, either for lethal or non-lethal methods, in 40 or 50 years of research on predator control across North America and Europe. Since then, colleagues and I from 21 other colleagues and I from 10 countries published a worldwide look, and we relaxed the standards of evidence that I discussed earlier, not just the gold and the silver standard. We looked at other standards of evidence for predator control, and we really didn't find any randomized controlled trials without bias that were consistently showing effectiveness in predator control. Okay, now what about other human interests, right? So lethal management is used to protect human interests other than livestock. And here I'm going to cite some recent research from this year by Landre and his colleagues on cougars, on mountain lions, using a lot of data from California in comparison to data from other Western states and other parts of the country, where they found, interestingly, no decreases in human safety in places where cougars were recreationally hunted. And they didn't find changes in game populations of things like elk and mule deer, where there were heavier cougar hunting seasons. And even more recently, and not yet published, a worldwide review of methods for preventing black bear and grizzly bear and Asiatic bear damage to property. That review found very weak evidence that lethal management was effective, and much stronger evidence for non-lethal methods such as electric fencing. So, as far as I'm concerned, the evidence is strong for non-lethal methods, but weak for lethal methods, and that the standards of evidence have been quite low. So it doesn't seem like lethal management prevents losses of property reliably. In fact, there are a number of studies showing counterproductive results of lethal management, which raise the losses of livestock or lead to more danger for human interests. So that leaves us with the two last fact claims: that lethal management controls population size and distribution, or that it raises money for conservation. And what I'm going to do here, actually, I got a little ahead of myself here, so I want to justify why one should be using the gold standard, the randomized controlled experiment. Well, using ineffective interventions harms nature, animals, and people. Animals, both wild and domestic, can be harmed by ineffective interventions, so any government should not be promoting, supporting, or funding ineffective interventions, clearly. And the gold standard is used by biomedicine and the field of psychology, because you can't afford to treat and intervene with your patients ineffectively. It's an ethical question as well as a question of resources. So promoting ineffective interventions wastes money and time, and it can harm people and animals. So why not use the gold standard? Basically, who's afraid of strong evidence? And finally, we can only challenge the many inaccurate fact claims out there. We can only challenge them with science. And I just, to lighten the mood a little, I put into cartoons here. The bottom left, a dad explaining to his kid that daddy works in a fantastic land called academia. But on the flip side, on the right, the cartoon shows politicians removing letters from the Endangered Species Act. The letters that they've removed spell science, and what's left is just gibberish, gobbledygook. So these are obviously two extreme positions on the role of science or evidence in public policy. They're two extreme positions. On the one hand, you'll hear managers disparaging academics like myself as living in fantasy land. And on the other hand, you'll see perhaps interest groups disparaging the government or managers for ignoring science. And I think what we want is something we're in between. It's pretty obvious that we want to be able to use the best evidence in a feasible way to make public policy decisions. So the last two fact claims, just to remind you that we can control populations of native predators and their distribution using lethal management. And the second one, just to refresh your memory, the second one, my memory, that it raises money for conservation. I'm just going to sort of throw down the flag here and say that neither of these are actual fact claims. They have aspects of fact claims in them. You could ask, is it effective in controlling distribution and abundance of native predators? And you could ask, does it raise money? But they're actually hiding in these questions are value judgments. Because even if they're true in a particular situation, these fact claims arise from fundamental value judgments. Why should we humans control who lives and dies or reproduces? And why is it important to raise money for conservation? And is killing the best way to do it? So there's actual value judgments that precede the last fact claims. And therefore, I'm not going to address them further as fact claims. So I'm just going to end with my recommendations, and they're very much, my own, rather idiosyncratic, related to the research I've done on fact claims. But I really recommend to policymakers, to managers, to honestly separate value judgments and fact claims. They can be separable, they should be separable. And then secondly, stop favoring anthropocentric exploiters. By this I mean those who give the greatest priority to humans, and especially the greatest priority to those who would consume, extract, or exploit nature, and particularly native predators in this current context. Third, use gold standard evidence for all the reasons I've stated. And number four, currently the evidence doesn't support any of the fact claims for killing predators. In my case, I would say definitely for killing wolves, probably for killing cougars based on Landre's studies. Increasingly, it's looking like the evidence doesn't support many of the fact claims for killing bears either. So it's getting vanishingly thin on the ground, the evidence for killing any native predators. Number five, currently the evidence is better for non-lethal methods, and they are safer for domestic animals too. So again, my citations. And with that, I thank you very much. Here's my contact information, which you'll see at other venues. I'm going to stop sharing my video so I can take questions in person. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adrian. John, do you want to pose a question from our attendees?
Sure. First, I want to thank you, Adrian. Outstanding presentation. And we will be doing our best at Rewilding Earth and Project Coyote to provide links to Adrian's papers and to run the recording of this excellent webinar. So tell your friends about it. Tell your family about it. Have everybody look at it. Important lessons here. Adrian, an excellent question from Kendra Chamberlain. Any studies looking at how tolerance of wolves among ranching communities shifts or does not shift during periods of economic uncertainty? I'm asking because we've seen an unusually large amount of Mexican gray wolves killed legally through wildlife services this year in New Mexico and Arizona, and this is obviously a bad year for beef.
Okay, thanks for that question. And I'm sorry to disappoint that I'm not aware of research that's looked at attitudes before and after, economic changes like those you describe. And in fact, there are very few studies that measure the same individuals over time. Instead, you see a lot of studies of attitudes and tolerance that are cross-sectional. They study a group of people before an event and then a different group of people after an event. So your question is worth digging into deeper, definitely. There are hints in the literature that I don't think have been fully publicized and explored like they should be. I would add that in the case of Mexican wolves, I'm going to put some money down to predict that, I'm not literally putting money down, but I would predict that the initiation of the modified 10J rule recently that liberalized Mexican wolf killing in a variety of situations, that was probably the catalyst for additional illegal killing of Mexican wolves. We're testing that at the moment, and in order to achieve some of that, in order to avoid bias, because I just made a prediction, I'm actually blind to the results, those analyses that we're doing. So my PhD, Francisco Santiago Avila, and my, well, okay, he's his own man. He's the postdoc in my lab, Francisco, and a PhD candidate in my lab, Naomi Lacharan, are the ones who are actually doing the analyses, and they're not making those kinds of predictions because we want to avoid unintentionally biasing the results with the kind of prediction I just made. Thank you.
So Adrian, Charles asks, how big of a role would you say poaching has played in the post-2012 decline of the wild red wolf population in eastern North Carolina to the alarming level they are at now?
Okay, terrific question, thank you. Here I'm gonna cite the work of Joey Hinton, Joseph Hinton, Dr. Joseph Hinton, and Suzanne Agan, who's a PhD candidate at Antioch University of New England, with whom I work. I'm on her committee. So I'm citing their work that shows a spike both in observed poaching and that disappearance of radio-collared red wolves in the last 7 to 10 years. So I believe we are seeing the same pattern. Here again, I'm making a prediction because the analyses haven't been done, haven't been completed. I would predict that every time the Fish and Wildlife Service and the state of North Carolina relaxed protections or increased the amount of coyote killing in the red wolf area, I would predict that each time we're seeing more illegal killing of red wolves for the same reasons I described in today's talk for Wisconsin and Michigan's gray wolves. Thanks for that question.
Deborah asks, can you answer the question of whether cougar conflict is due to high harvest or high density so that we can argue this more strongly?
Okay, so here I would refer you, so the article that I cited by Landre, that I cited in the webinar, would be your best source to find all of the following. But I'm citing work from Dr. Peebles, I'm going to forget all the researchers, out of Rob Wielgus's lab, Dr. Robinson, and I know I'm forgetting a key reference to cougar research in Washington State, where they demonstrated that recreational killing of resident male lions, male mountain lions, was followed by immigration by several new younger males. So what you tend to see apparently after hunting cougars is you see more cougars there in the following years. And for many years, there are more cougars than there were before the hunt. And those young males, as they jockey for position and dominance and a full territory, appear to kill more cattle than the original resident had. And apologies for forgetting the key researcher here, but Landre's paper will have all those references.
Camilla, if we have time, I wonder if Adrian would ask this good anonymous question. Has your lab looked at monetary incentives like payment for presence or reimbursement for livestock losses and how that may change human attitudes over time? Monetary incentives.
Okay, super good question, anonymous. So we do have a paper, Lisa Naughton Treves, before I even founded my lab, I was a co-author on that paper, looked at the effect of compensation, or tried to measure the effect of compensation in Wisconsin on tolerance for wolves. And I say that we tried to evaluate the effect of compensation because we didn't at that time have before and after measures. So what we did was we compared the attitudes and tolerance of people who had received compensation to those who believed they had lost domestic animals but had not received compensation. And the conclusion of that study was there was no significant difference in tolerance between those two groups. So Lisa Naughton concluded that the compensation had not improved their attitudes towards wolves or decreased their inclination to poach. but we really need the before and after of the same individuals to understand the effect of those payments for losses. Super good question. Please follow up with me separately if you're interested in more. There's a lot of research on compensation around the world.
So I think maybe time for one more question. John asks, has there been any research done on pay for presence programs, particularly with respect to raising social tolerance of predators?
Yes, there has. So the idea here is to pay those who are coexisting near the carnivores so that they pay them for living carnivores rather than most compensations after the fact, which are for paying for dead livestock, it's often said. So yeah, I think the best research on this comes out of Sweden, where research on the measurement of Sami reindeer herders' attitudes and their poaching of wolverines before and after incentive payments are suggesting that the incentive payments for the Sami reindeer herders to allow wolverines to den reduced Sami poaching of female wolverines. So the female wolverines were allowed to survive and to den because the Sami received incentive payments, that's the interpretation, but they continued to poach male wolverines. Nevertheless, the wolverine population has done better in those areas than in areas where no incentives are paid. That's research by Zabel et al. And a Scandinavian team, the lead author, Jens, sorry, I forgot his last name. Contact me if you'd like that reference.
Okay, I realize that we're 10 minutes after. Do you have any parting comments, Adrian, before we sign off? And let me mention to everyone too that Adrian has kindly said that he will answer the questions that he was unable to today. So we will add that to our landing page where you can also see the recording, share it with others. Thank you, Adrian. And if you have any last comments that you'd like to share. Or...
No, I'm grateful for your time and thanks for the whole setup with the Zoom. Thank you.
Thank you. John, any last comments you want to share?
I just want to thank everybody for being here. And as Jack mentioned earlier, that we hope Rewilding Institute and Project Coyote are a ongoing series of coexistence and carnivore webinars. So please keep watching these.
Yeah, and let me just mention as the last thing, if you're not on our e-team, you can sign up on our homepage, projectcoyote.org, also on Rewilding's homepage. We will certainly alert you to future joint co-branded webinars. So stay tuned for more to come. Thank you all.